Welcome to Your Health. And folks, everybody I know in one way or another has been touched by some form of mental illness or mental problems or needs some kind of psychiatric help. It happens. And it happens to young and it happens to old. And we are so fortunate to have with us Dr. Will Rutland. We're just so glad to have you back home. And you know what, we're talking about you can't do any solutions to any problems that you don't identify.
That's exactly right.
So help our audience to understand when we talk about mental health and psychiatry.
You know, it's such a prescient thing for you to say, Virginia. You cannot solve a problem without understanding the problem well. And I really think that that's the way that we have to approach mental health here in America, because there is certainly a crisis ongoing, and we need to understand in a granular way what's driving that. And once we see that problem clearly, then we can construct the solution. And there are solutions. In fact, we're working on a couple of them right now here in Montgomery.
That's great.
Yeah, well, I can't wait to talk about that, but I better start with the problem. And really the problem reduces down to a simple supply and demand sort of disjunction. And so maybe it's best to think about the demand part first and then the supply part as a potential solution. And I guess I'll start broadly. You know, the United States is in the midst of a mental health crisis. I know we hear about that. You know, it's on the news all the time. Yep. We're seeing the effects not only of sort of pre-existing stresses just because of modern life, but then of course the COVID pandemic and ongoing sort of instability around the world. People are at their wits' end, and mental health has really started to affect us in a very serious way. Sadly, it tends to affect the most vulnerable parts of the population most severely. So our children and our elderly are really suffering the brunt of this. In fact, I'll give you a couple of statistics. I don't mean to be a downer here at the front end, but our kids are so important. You know, I have two little girls of my own who I adore.
Beautiful.
And so often the health of our children are at the forefront of my mind. You may recall that my wife is a pediatric nurse practitioner, so she keeps me on my toes. But in any event, you know, kids were already sort of suffering from a burden of mental illness before the pandemic. In fact, at that time, about 1 in 5 children had a diagnosed mental illness or behavioral issue. So think about that. And just to sort of compound the problem, only 1 in 25 of them were getting the care that they needed. That was before the pandemic. But a CDC survey during the pandemic in 2020 suggested that parents in America, about 70% of parents in America, had identified either behavioral or mental illness in their own children. And so that's a huge jump. And it was really visited in the most severe ways. We saw pediatric emergency room visits for mental illness, suicidality, all of that go up significantly. So kids are suffering. The elderly are suffering. You know, we talk about the silver tsunami, and as much as we love our grandparents, we're happy to have the silver tsunami these days, but that sort of baby boomer generation is progressing beyond 65 and later into life. I like to think of that as further into wisdom. But
that sounds good. I'll agree with that.
Wiser every moment. But along with that wisdom comes some challenges. You likely know folks who are living with one or the other forms of dementia.
Yes.
Brain disease. And so, you know, we're seeing on both sides of the age curve, things are getting harder. And it ends up in the most tragic outcomes. So again, not to bring us down, but homicide and suicide are the second and third leading causes of death for young folks. Brain disease and dementia are the fourth and fifth leading causes for elderly folks. So these are pressing issues. They are causing us severe problems in our communities right now, today. And that's really something that we have to address. Now, I occasionally get this question about Alzheimer's. I'm sure you're familiar with this.
I was going to ask you that.
So that's a good one. You know, folks will ask me, you know, is Alzheimer's the same thing as dementia? Can we treat it? What do we do? I have a loved one who's suffering, you know.
Right.
And they are more or less the same thing in a way. So Alzheimer's is a type of dementia. Now, there are other types that, you know, folks will have heard about, stuff like frontotemporal dementia, which can sort of change our behaviors a little bit. Parkinsonian dementia, so Parkinson's disease can sort of progress into dementia. There's a cerebrovascular dementia, which is an overly fancy term for when you're not getting correct blood flow to the brain, that can cause trouble.
Okay.
Each of those look a little bit differently, and we treat them a little bit differently, but they're all part of that big category of dementia.
Okay.
And Alzheimer's is the most common one.
Well, you told me something interesting when we were talking about Alzheimer's is a little slower and
Yeah, so the cognitive decline in Alzheimer's, so sort of what we see with the thinking, is a more gradual decline. Oftentimes we'll start with little things like forgetting details, losing the keys, sometimes stuff like getting lost. But it can be hard to identify at the front end because you preserve that long-term memory. So you may
Right.
know folks who can tell you, oh,
Right.
this is what I did on my high school prom night, or this is who I voted for in the 1962 presidential election, or whatever it may have been. And so you'll get that long-term memory preservation, and that can mask things a little bit. But over the course of time, that too will go, and we'll see sort of behavioral and a lot of psychological and psychiatric problems develop. And something important about that piece of it is not only do the patients themselves start to suffer from things like depression and anxiety, even hallucinations and some sort of psychosis related symptoms, but their caregivers are suffering.
Yeah.
Here you have this beloved family member who is suffering a clear illness, and it can feel so helpless.
Amen.
And so,
Well, Will, we're going to do 2 more segments with Dr. Rutland.
sure.
And we're going to follow up now. We've talked about what the problems are. We're going to talk about working with them
Sure.
and what we need and how we can change things. So we'll be with you next Sunday. And thanks so much for being with us. And we'll be right back.